As we enter into a new year, we face a lot of uncertainty and potential hardship. And maybe that's a good thing in that this really isn't any different time. We just happen to have a mark on a calendar, but we seem to enter into this time period on a yearly basis with this idea that we've hit some magic reset button and everything's going to be wonderful and great and better. Every year is going to be the year where everything is better. And this year, there aren't very many people with that feeling. And I was thinking about how we, approach some uncertainty even with the hope of good. And the children of Israel had been in bondage for 400 years, and the book of Exodus is all about how they got free. God set them free and called them his own. They were his. And he set them free in a very powerful and amazing and miraculous way. The whole world was like, oh my goodness. Pharaoh's army wiped out. They looted the most powerful nation in the world with no army. And yet within weeks, when they got a little uncertain or when they got a little uncomfortable, they began looking for other answers. They immediately said, let's see if this will work instead. Or they began to moan and complain. As soon as things got uncomfortable, they began to doubt that God was good. He had just set them free. But maybe he's not really good. And because of that, a whole generation of chosen by God people failed to realize the fullness of the promise. But they never stopped being his chosen people. They never stopped being his. And they still did not get disqualified for the ultimate promise. One generation later, Joshua takes over from Moses, and he's a good leader and a man of God. We remember him for things like the Battle of Jericho, where he followed the letter of what God told him to do, and they achieved victory, and they took the land and moved into the promised land. But in Joshua chapter 9, we see another side. God had told them not to make alliances, not to make quarters, not to make friends, not to mingle with the inhabitants, because they would bring them into sin. They would bring them into following other gods. They would compromise their relationship with God. And he had done some miraculous things on their behalf, and some of the surrounding nations were rightfully worried. So they came to Joshua and they said, hey, we come from a long way off. We're not really your neighbors. Make an alliance with us. And what you'll not see, if you look at Joshua chapter 9, is you won't see Joshua or any of the other leaders of Israel seeking God on what they should do. They did what they thought was good, and they did what they thought was right, and they made an alliance with someone that they shouldn't have made an alliance with. And it was brought to their attention a few days later that they had made a mistake. Oh my goodness, why did you tell us that? Why did you tell us you weren't our neighbors? And then you see a second thing. See, we tend to do sometimes what their generation back had done. We look for other answers and forget that God is good, and we start complaining as soon as things get uncomfortable or uncertain. And then sometimes we do what Joshua and the leaders of Israel did in this situation. We do what we think is right, what we think is good. They said, well, we've made this pledge, we've made this honor, we swore that we would honor this alliance, so we will. And you'll be our servants, and you'll live with us, and you'll do this for us and that for us. And it sounds good. They're keeping their word. But if you enter into a contract with someone and you find out they were fraudulent in what they represent, you don't feel any obligation to honor your part of that. The contract is void. And doing what we think is right and honoring what we think is right is never more important than doing what God has told us to do. See, they chose their honor and their word and what the surrounding nations might think about whether or not they kept their word over obeying God. And because of that, they made an alliance they shouldn't have made. They honored that alliance when it wasn't done rightly. And those people stayed with them. And sure enough, they slipped, and they struggled, and they fell. And they never fully had the victory in that promised land that they were supposed to. And yet, they remained God's chosen people. And he still brought the promise. Fast forward a couple of thousand years. Israel is in captivity. Rome rules them. Yet they have a king. He thinks he's a king. He's a puppet. It doesn't mean much. He has no real power. He's subject to Rome. His people are suffering. They don't have the realization of the promise of being God's chosen people. And somewhere between a miraculous birth in a stable and 2 years later, some men show up and say, hey, we've seen the signs, and we've read and heard the prophecies, and we know there's a king here who's going to set people free. We've come to worship him. And a selfish, power-hungry man who had no real power had a chance to say, our people can be free. I can be free. Instead, he said, what little power I have, I'm going to hold on to. I'm not giving up my rule. And countless innocent 2-year-old and younger babies died because this man didn't want to give up the illusion of power and control. And we do that too. We start feeling that we have control of our lives. We have control over this. We have the power to decide what we want and how we're going to do things. And God says, hey, here's a way to be free. Here's a way to have life. And we respond with, I don't want to give up my control. And we hurt people. And we hurt ourselves. Yet God still kept his word and kept his promise. 3 decades later, the promise walked into the public scene. And he said, I am here. The light has come. There is a way to have relationship with the one who made you. And the people didn't see it because they thought they knew what the Messiah was going to look like. And they thought they knew what God was going to do, the how he was going to do it, the way he was going to do it, and what he was going to look like doing it. And this didn't fit their preconceptions. And so they rejected the very way that God had brought to them. And we do that too. God's going to do this, and God's going to do that, and God's going to do it this way because that's the way I want. That's the way that'll be easiest in my eyes. That's the way that'll be more comfortable. And when God says, I've got a different plan, we go, no, that's not right. And we can miss it. We can miss it. And yet, he still loved them. He still chose them. And he still brought the promise. And a few years later, the promise went to the cross. It said, you know what? No matter how many times you've looked to another answer, no matter how many times you've doubted that I am good, no matter how many times you've railed and complained and shook your fist at me, no matter how many times you did what was right in your eyes, but it wasn't my way and it screwed everything up, no matter how many times you were selfish and self-centered and tried to hold on to your power and your control and hurt people, no matter how many times you thought I was going to do one thing and so you didn't pay attention to what I was doing, even when you were just flat out my enemy and hated me, I die for you. I love you. I take your place. And so that's what he did for us. And he rose. And so now we have life. But sometimes I can't help but wonder. I know the cross would have still been the cross. And Jesus would have still come. And I believe he would have come when he did. But I can't help but wonder sometimes how different the Old Testament would have read if the singing and the rejoicing and the praising God that happened on the shores of the Red Sea had continued for 6 weeks, because that's about what it would have taken for them to march into Canaan. And I can't help but wonder how differently some of the other books of the Old Testament would have read had Joshua just stopped for a minute and said, well, what do you want me to do here, God? Or even if he hadn't done that at the beginning, when he realized the mistake, said, we entered into this alliance under false pretenses, and I know we gave our word, but we gave our word under false pretenses, and God said this, so no, we're not going to honor this alliance, and you will not corrupt us. If maybe Babylon wouldn't have happened a few generations later. what would have happened? How differently might the story have read if Herod had bowed the knee? If the men who knew the scriptures better than anyone in the world besides the one they were talking to had said, you know, this man speaks with authority. There's a reason for it. So as we go into uncertain times, instead of maybe trying to figure out how we can make things better and what we can do to stay safe and prosper, what if we just surrender and praise and not look to another answer and say, Lord, I will follow you. And when things are uncomfortable, I know you're still good. And that if I stay where I'm going in your will, it's going to be temporary. The promise is coming. When I pause, even when I think I know the right thing to do, and say, is this really what you want me to do, God? And check. When myself rises up and says, I'm going to hold on to control, I say, no. My life and the lives of innocent people around me depend on me bowing the knee. And when I remain humble and teachable and say, okay, I think I know the word. But when the Spirit comes and says, I'm the teacher, then I listen. Then no matter what hardships and uncertainty and pain and struggle might come in this 2021, we can all have more life and more freedom than we've ever had before. Because of what Jesus did on that cross, because he is faithful to keep his promise.